Hey everyone, welcome to Snowpal's Software Development and Architecture podcast. We have a very special guest with us today. We have Valentina Thörner, who's a product advisor, author, and remote leadership mentor who works with leaders in SaaS in the tech industry to enable operational excellence for their product organizations. I couldn't be happier to welcome Valentina. Thank you so much for taking time to have this conversation.
Thanks for having me.
Lovely. Without further ado, we can get started with your book. I'm going to, for folks who are watching this, we're going to have a conversation around remote work, the challenges, and our experiences. It's going to be a conversation in that regard. I'm going to refer you to the book that Valentina wrote. It's called From a Distance. That's the title. I'll include links in the podcast as well, so you can check that out. From a Distance: Strategies and Tools for Leading Remote Support Teams. So we're going to start with some items in your book, and then we
hmm
can let the conversation sort of drive us. Uh, One of the first things when I was looking through that caught my attention in that book was the reason remote work won't work for your company, right? So if you could just start there, and maybe you can start the conversation from there.
I think, and it's like, so the book was actually written before the pandemic because I have been working and advising in remote positions for well over a decade now. And it's very interesting that now we're having this discussion whether remote work works or remote work doesn't work, and when is it the right option and when is it not the right option. And I think remote work will not work for your company if you are a control freak in terms of you need to see that people are working. Like you need
Right.
to be able to look at their computer because remote work requires trust and measurements. I mean, trust alone is not enough. You also need to have clear KPIs and clear expectations so that people actually know what they are working on. But at the end of the day, you need to trust the people that you hire, that they're going to do their job in whichever way works. And something that's kind of popular in some parts of the industry is to track every movement on the screen. That won't work. It undermines trust and it basically reuses the energy of the employees to figure out how to hack the system instead of how to optimize the work that they should actually be doing.
Right. So let me ask you something there, right? So you said the book was written prior to the pandemic, right?
hmm
The prior was written. So as we get deeper into that response of yours there, do you see any fundamental differences? Like if you were to have written this book today versus when you wrote it, would it
hmm
be a little bit different or would it be dramatically different?
I think it would be a little bit different in terms of that we need to be a lot more inclusive to different kind of people nowadays. Because before the pandemic, if you were working remotely, there was kind of this self-selection process. People started working remotely because they enjoyed working in a remote setting. Maybe they don't like people, like it's great for introverts that don't have to go to the office. Maybe you belong to a minority and can't really work from an office because of whatever your health, your
Right.
personal situation. So before the pandemic, people who ended up working remotely, they had prepared for the reality of being in a remote job. They did research, they learned lots of skills on how to, and we didn't have all of this like video communication that we have nowadays. A lot of
Right.
things simply happened in writing. So there was a clear self-selection that favored writers, people who can express themselves succinctly in the written word. Nowadays, there's lots of people who want to work remotely, not because they want to optimize their work, but because they want to optimize their lives. They know that remote work is basically a tool that can make the rest of their lives easier. So that means they now know that this option exists. They want to do it, but they may be lacking some skills. They may actually need support in getting the social interactions that they need to stay like mentally healthy. And suddenly the companies have a lot more uh, a lot more responsibility in helping these people who did not self-select for the way of work, but who do want to do this way of work. And then the question is how we as a company, how can we help them? Because it's easy to say, oh, everybody should go asynchronous and just learn how to write. But that is just the same as when before the pandemic, we told the introverts to just be more extroverted. It doesn't
Absolutely.
work that way.
You bring up some really good points, and excuse me if you hear some typing noise because I'm trying to make notes as you speak so I can follow up
Don't
on it.
worry.
And I'm not good at making those, but so it might be. Hopefully, there's not too much sound there. You brought up some really good points. Before I go to the next items in your book, I want to go back to what you mentioned earlier. You mentioned that the remote work wouldn't work. The first item that I brought up was one of the reasons you mentioned is companies having this urge or a necessity for reasons not very clear to me, to be honest with you,
Mm.
where you need to know what Valentina is doing at a certain given point of time, or what Krish is
Hmm.
actually doing tracking your system. That comes across as preposterous when we say it, but it's true that it does happen, right? It happens
It
all the
happens a
time.
lot.
But let me ask this question, and I'm trying to play the devil's advocate here to some extent, if you will. You're giving me some work to do, right? You say, hey, Krish, can you, I'm talking as a developer, for instance,
Uh-huh.
right? Krish, can you get this thing implemented? I'm going to say, yeah, I can do it. It's going to take me, like, say, 3 sessions. And a session at Snowpal is like 4 hours. Let's say I
Uh-huh.
tell you, maybe in 3 sessions, I'll get most of it done and I'll socialize that with you. Why do you need, I'm going to put you in that situation, even though you're not proposing that. Why do you, if you have to sort of support that argument,
Uh-huh.
why would you have the need to actually monitor when I'm doing that work, what I'm working on, how consecutive or contiguous my work is? Because
Hmm.
all that you care is, am I able to get what I promised to get done by the
Hmm.
time I promised you? So if you can speak to why they are doing that.
I think it has a lot to do with fear. Like, from a manager point of view, what is actually my work in a remote setting? Because I clearly cannot stroll over the open office floor and do
Monitor.
the management by flyby charade. Like, how do I justify what I'm doing? So controlling other people feels like you're doing your job. And most middle managers specifically, they don't really get a lot of support. You become a manager because you were the highest performing person on your team, or before because you were the most senior person on your team, and then good luck. I hope you can figure out what you're supposed to do. Like, not a lot of companies actually have like management or leadership courses that they channel their people through so that the people know what they should be doing in this leadership position. And then the other thing is, if you ask fully office based managers what are the expectations for the people on their team, what are the KPIs, do they use OKRs, are there any goals, do they measure anything, you're going to get blank stares because I know they are working. I'm seeing them in the office every day. I mean, they must be doing something.
Something.
And that is missing when you're remote because suddenly I don't know that you're working because I'm not seeing you sitting at your desk. So what's the next best solution? I'm just going to track your computer. That way at least I know whether you're sitting at your desk.
Okay, fair enough, right? So the point is, maybe there is an element of insecurity as well, to some
Mm-mm.
extent. So I need to prove that I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing. Okay, now I'm going to take the other position now. You've given me work. 3 sessions later, I'm supposed to deliver something to you. Now let's take this 3 sessions and make it a bit lengthier, right? Maybe it's going to take me a week to get something done, right?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe I'll report status frequently enough, yet it's going to take a week. Now, if you don't monitor and you don't know what Krish is doing, when he's actually going to be doing that work, what if I came back 2 days after and I was working on something quite different from, I mean, I'm just going to make a bunch of assumptions to
Mm-hmm.
make the conversation easier because, you get the devil is in the detail, you get more specific, it gets more tricky. But
Yeah.
let's say I come back to you after 2 days, which is 40% of the time, right? Of the
Mm-hmm.
time that I actually promised to you. And I'm showing, hey, Valentina, here's what I had done in the last couple of days. And you're like, oh my God, this is, you started on on the wrong foot, meaning this is completely wrong, right? It makes
Mm-hmm.
no sense at all, right? I know I'm exaggerating the problem, but sometimes it's like it's like Indian movies. uh, uh, you have to the element of exaggeration sometimes helps, sometimes doesn't. So I'm going to exaggerate this and say 2 days after you're shocked. You're disappointed.
Well, the
40% of the time is
solution
wasted.
is the solution is actually the solution that would work for Indian movies as well. If everybody involved just sat down and talked about their assumptions and what they were doing, we wouldn't have a 4-hour Bollywood movie because the things would have been settled in the very first 5 minutes. And I think that's crucial. Like remote work requires a lot more conscious conversations, communication than when you're in the office. Because in the office, I can kind of see what you're doing. I also can see when you're stuck because you're probably looking at your desk like with a
Right.
clear indication that you are stuck. And then I can walk over and say, hey, Krish, it looks like you don't really know how to, can I help you somehow? And of course, online, I don't see that. So as a manager, but also as a team, there need to be checkpoints during the week. Let's say we have a one-on-one every week, or you update we do an asynchronous stand-up every morning where you just write down what you're working on today. And as a manager, I should be looking at your stand up, and it can be a written thing. It doesn't need to be a call. And then that way I get a sense of what you're working for or where you are stuck. And that's something that you can actually help facilitate with processes. Like if there is a stand up every morning where you write down what you're doing and what's blocking you, I mean, that's just standard Scrum practice. You just adapt it to online, to remote, and then it works as well. But it requires communication. If I gave you a task and you know that you're going to take 1.5 or 2 days, and then I'm not going to see anything of you during those 2 days, something is probably missing. Like I would like to then also see you maybe in a Slack channel or in a team space that you're sharing, I don't know, the music that you're listening to while you're coding or something. Like just give sometimes signs of that you're alive and
Absolutely,
actually
right?
doing something.
So
And it needs to happen from both sides.
these are very valid points, right? So let me take an example. I, much like yourself, even prior to the days, I've been doing remote work for a long, long time, right? For a
Mm-hmm.
long time. So during the pandemic, there wasn't much of an adjustment from my perspective because I was just continuing to do what I was always doing. And
Yeah.
even after, I'm still in that position. And
Mm-hmm.
you mentioned a few reasons why people might want to do it. Being an introvert is possibly one reason. There could be
Mm-hmm.
other reasons, like, the commute. I mean, if you're living in certain cities, I don't know what the average commute is uh, there, like in Spain, Valentina, but let's say I can take it's about 45 minutes, I think, give or take, in the Washington, D.C. metro area, right?
Yeah.
At the minimum. At the minimum, you're talking 45 minutes. I know people who are actually spending a lot longer in the mornings or evenings actually going there and getting back. So a fair bit of your energy is lost. No matter what
Mm-hmm.
demographic you're in, it's hard or it's inarguable that you are spending energy on traffic. And I don't know how many people enjoy, actually doing that sort of a commute. So
I
there
don't think there are a lot of people. I mean, yeah, podcasts are amazing and you can read books, but I'd rather listen to the podcast while I'm walking
and you
through my
make it
neighborhood than somewhere stuck in a car or in the
absolutely right.
metro.
Absolutely. So these are pragmatic issues. But let's say, coming back to one of the early items you mentioned, trust, right? I want to use the
Hmm.
word trust here. If because given the fact that I've done remote work all the time, I want to speak from my perspective as well.
Hmm.
I've never had somebody monitor my screen, and I could never have done a job if somebody did. I would have honestly even not even taken up that position. I'd be like, no,
Yeah,
thank
I
you,
was
right?
about to say
Right.
that. I wouldn't.
And so, is there a fundamental issue? In other words, if Valentina and Krish work together as co-workers, and we've established that trust, and how to establish this trust is a slightly different discussion. But let's say
Mm.
we establish that trust. Does that mean we alleviated like 95% of the issues surrounding the problems we're discussing up until this moment?
Yes. So I think it's trust plus communication plus clear expectations.
Okay.
So if I'm hiring you or you're hiring me, I kind of already expect that we have made an informed decision of working together. So there is a baseline of trust
Okay.
that is there, because otherwise we would not work. Like if I don't trust you, I'm not going to hire you. So the question is basically null. But if I'm hiring you, okay, I trust that you can do the job because that's what I hired you for. And then the next thing is, okay, be very, very clear with the expectation. Hey, I'm hiring you or you're hiring me or whatever. And these are the things that I expect you to do. And in return, these are the things that you expect for me to provide.
Okay.
because it's not just that I'm dropping the project on you and then I'm going to leave, but like you probably have like also questions that you need answered. So you also trust me to give you the answers that you need to actually proceed with the project. So it's this trust is kind of the starting point, and then we reinforce that trust through communication, ongoing communication about the things that need to get done.
Makes a lot of sense, right? So to have that communication going beyond trust, I need to have that comfort level. In other words, we are, when you're working in a company with a group of people, we are helping each other achieve a common
Hmm.
purpose for the company. It could be for profit, it could be not for profit, right? Doesn't matter. That is something you need to achieve. So there is a goal. It's not, it's not like going, I know what a parallel example is. If I go to lunch, I'm grabbing pot belly. If I did it a half hour later, not a big deal, right? I can grab
Yeah,
that
yeah.
sandwich later. Whereas work, there is a commitment because I have a commitment towards you as somebody I'm reporting to. You have a
Hmm.
commitment towards your manager, and the company has a commitment towards its client, and the client has
Yeah.
their commitment towards their end user. So it's a chain
Hmm.
essentially. So if somebody doesn't do what they're supposed to do, there is a way to recover to some extent, but he couldn't recover, right? So this is business.
Hmm.
We are in the business of making money or helping somebody, whatever the purpose is. Uh, with that said, how do I establish that comfort to say that, hey, Valentina, I know I promised to do this in 3 sessions. Things are actually, it turns out that it's a little bit more difficult, right?
Hmm.
And now let me preface the question with making it a little bit even more difficult than it already might be. I'm just out of college. I'm a new graduate. My
Uh-huh.
comfort levels there might be a little bit different. I've done this for 5 years. I've worked in that company for 3 years. If I've done this for 20 years, I've worked in the company for 18 years, then
Hmm.
there's the game is a whole lot different, right? So
Yeah.
if we were to draw a spectrum, like if I were to draw this out, the, that person and the company could be anywhere in that. How
Hmm.
should we go about this?
Trust and communication depends on people knowing each other. So, from a basically psychological point of view, we like people or we get along with people that are similar to ourselves. What this similar means can be very, very, very different. And the idea is that if you're working with somebody, you have to find the things that you're similar in. Maybe you both have kids the same age. Maybe you both did, for example, my major is actually in political science. So maybe you are also from the social science originally and then ended up in tech and no one really knows why. Or maybe you love dancing, or maybe you like cooking. Like you need to establish with the people that you work with those kind of similarities, not because they're relevant for the work itself, but they are relevant for how you work together and how you connect with each other. Because if we've talked about our favorite recipe, it will be much easier for you to tell me about the struggles that you're having with your work because we've already established a baseline that we aren't that different, that like we do have things in common. And that sounds very wishy washy because it's like, oh, it's all those, yeah, human things. But at the end of the day, we are humans that work together. I think if a work relationship only evolves around work, revolves around work, then you end up with kind of like a gig economy where I've hired you to do this job, and once the job is done, you're out. But that's not the idea. If we're working together in a long-term project, and long-term relationships are actually much more interesting, also in terms of what you can create as a coworker, then we need to establish like a long-term affinity on how we can talk with each other. And that may just be that we're both equally sarcastic or have equally weird type of humor that we can like
Relate
draw
to.
on. But that's very, it is important. And that's why often remote companies actually do these meetups from time to time where people can get together and actually get to know each other like on a more personal level and not just around work.
These are such great points, and I'm going to tell you something. In the few weeks I've had these collaborative podcasts with early days for me. I've been doing podcasting for a bit, but not with people, and I'm enjoying this immensely. And the fact is, I don't think any of the sessions I've had have been one. I always thought, okay, I can cover the topic, fair enough in an hour and a half. Maybe because I'm chatty and verbose,
Hmm.
also because the folks who are coming are extremely smart, much like yourself. I'm going to say that I'm going to call this podcast, sorry folks, one of N. I'm going to have to convince Valentina to hop back on this call because I have a lot of questions about every single thing that
Hmm.
you're talking about here. Let's go a little bit deeper, right? You mentioned, you took some great examples. You talked about personal relationships, right? You said, hey, I need to have these conversations with you outside of work. By outside of work, I don't mean like outside of work hours, but outside of the work, the scope
Hmm.
of work that we're actually involved in. So we know each other a little bit better. So I have that trust and comfort in having those communications with you. I couldn't agree more with you. But I'm going to ask you a couple of questions that may or may not be easy questions, at least for me to answer
Hmm.
them if someone asked me. Cultural differences, right? Now let me take as an engineer, right? I'm a developer. I
Hmm.
run a company, but at the heart, I'm a developer. I do a lot of other things around what the company needs. But if you ask me, if you woke me up the first and you told me nothing, my fingers will start trying to write some code because that's my
Yeah.
natural only skill. And in that capacity, uh, I've noticed that developers come just like everybody else. I'm not speaking. I'm not saying this is specific to developers, but I'm just speaking to the people that I work with most of the time.
Hmm.
I don't know about being introvert or extroverts because when I have conversations, when I've gotten on these podcasts, people have been surprised that I'm chatty because they're like, hey, you're a
Yeah.
developer, so you should probably be this quiet person who's just writing code. So there is a stigma and a stereotype, which, it's okay, right? It's all of them. These things exist in the world. But it's also not inaccurate to say that a lot of the developers like to, just do the work in front of a machine, get the stuff done and move on, right? To a large extent.
Hmm.
I don't think I'm wrong in stating that. Establishing personal relationships, one, may or may not come naturally, right? And the second
Hmm.
point is, uh, the culture of where you're located. You could be working in a remote position. I've worked with
Hmm.
folks, pretty much all over the US, and number of places in Europe, and most recently in South America and in South
Hmm.
Asia as well. And I've enjoyed this immensely because we are all humans, we are all developers doing the same thing, but how we approach a problem, the cognitive aspects of it from an engineering
Hmm.
standpoint, the non-cognitive aspects of it as well from a personal relationship standpoint, everything is. I'm going to give you some examples, but before I throw you those examples, they are very, very different. I mean, what is your perspective on? I mean, do you agree that the breadth is the magnitude of those differences as much as I'm making it out to be, in your opinion?
So the thing is, and I really like that conversation because in a remote environment, we are suddenly interested in those in differences. Because it's very rare that you hear people that are going to an office actually acknowledge that everybody is different and that everybody has their own experience. But of course, in the office, like if you come in and you look like you haven't slept in like 5 days, and I know that you just came back from paternity leave, it's very easy for me to say, oh no, she's
Right,
teething, right? Like
right,
it will pass, like you get through it. And we have an immediate connection. But because I got that visual cue. So online, it's like, how can we establish not necessarily protocols, but spaces where people can show up as they are without making it a 1 hour like presentation or something? Because when you come into the office and let's say you're radiant because you're super happy because I don't know, yesterday you ran your first marathon, but whatever, like people see this and people will respond to this because you're radiating this, oh my god, I could rule the world today. Or the other way around, when you're really really sad, people pick up on this and somebody is probably going to walk over and say, hey, like, is there anything that I can
right.
do to help? And online, we need to create spaces where people can actually show up as they are and others can react to it kind of naturally. And I don't know if you're using Slack at Snowpal, but in
Yeah,
Slack, you can just have your every company that I've worked with has a random channel where people can just put in GIFs, or
right,
uh, Today I Learned channel where people just put in a link to a blog post or to a podcast that they heard. And I think that's kind of the equivalent because you can show as much or as little as you want, and you can sometimes just react to things that other people put in there, but it creates this very very low effort way to share things that are going on in your life. And then if you have a channel for runners and one for, I don't know, pet owners, there's usually a cat channel as well, and people just put in a picture of their rescue cat, and like suddenly you add humanity to the mix. And in the office, you get that by default, just by people walking in. But in remote settings, you kind of need to create a space where people can do that and can engage with each other. And you'll always have people who are kind of very chatty and who like are in all the channels and participate in everything. And you'll always have a couple of people who like very rarely say something, but if they do, everybody listens. But that's the same in the office. So sometimes I think we just have to go back to what is it actually that we want to achieve. Okay, we want to achieve that people don't feel they have to hide anything. Okay, how can we do this in the office and how can we do that online? And then go via the what am I trying to achieve instead of how can I copy exactly what's happening in the office.
Okay, so let's talk about that, right? You mentioned, getting on these channels, for instance, on Slack. Uh, I know exactly what you mean, but is it anywhere close to the same? Like, for instance, like you mentioned, some people are active, some are not so active, right? And you get on these channels, uh, it is very I mean, is it fair to say that it's not anywhere? I mean, if you drew a spectrum 1 to 10, where 10 is Valentina and Krisha showing up at work, where you catch the
Mm-hmm.
fact that I ran a marathon, I look super happy, or not so excited that particular day, you're like, hey, can I help? Is everything all
Mm-hmm.
right? uh, if that is a 10, meaning phase is the index of mind, for at least for a lot of the people, so you can tell, not with everybody to a large extent. Where would you draw Slack and these channels? Is it like a 9 or 8 where it's very close, or is it like a 1 or a 2, which means it's not 0 but it's at the other end of that spectrum?
I would say if it's probably a 5 or a 6 if you combine it with meetups.
Okay, with video
So because
conversations and other things.
exactly. And those meetups don't have to be every week, which is why I'm not really a fan of hybrid, which kind of makes people stay in the high cost of living area without the
Right.
advantages of
But
actually getting regular interactions. But like every 4 months, every 6 months or something, let teams get together so that people can get to know each other. Because at the end of the day, even on Slack, you kind of realize if somebody who's usually very chatty and hasn't said anything in like 3 days, you realize, like you notice that. And then if you have sufficient like you know them sufficiently well, you might actually reach out and say, "Hey, you haven't said anything, but I know you're not on vacation. Like, what's up?"
Valentina, it's amazing you say that, because there is an element of care. You care, so even if it's
Mhm.
on Slack, right? So this has a fundamental assumption here. It's a beautiful assumption, and it's lovely if that was existential commonly, right? But what if
Mhm.
that notion of care may or may not exist in a corporate world? Here, you're trying to meet these deadlines, KPIs, OKRs, yada yada yada, and everyone's trying to just live life and doing these hustles.
Mhm.
Does anyone take a moment, pause for a second, and saying, hey, are you happy? uh, I don't know what else to say
Does that
there.
happen? So the thing is, people who care in the office and they care remotely. People who don't care won't ask you how you are, neither in the office nor online.
So which means the point is, it's brilliantly put, right? You said it brilliantly. Which means it's less about challenges coming with remote positions, right? Because if you were able to care while you were at work, you most likely, I
Hmm.
mean, I'm sure it's going to be a little bit more challenging for you to be able to tell if Krish ran a marathon or not, going with that example, but you'd
Yeah, yeah.
still would have that same level of care. So which means associating this to only something that can be done when you are at work versus that cannot be done remotely is not the right thing to do then, right?
No, basically, remote work, if there are any dysfunctions in your company, remote work will like really, really get them into the light.
It actually exacerbates that, right? So you can actually find that
Exactly.
out a lot sooner than you could do. Okay, these are,
Yeah.
I was just jotting down some points there. It's a personal relationships. Now, I will tell you that given the fact, I'm sure you've worked with folks from all over the world as well, but you might have noticed some subtle differences. Sometimes they are
Oh, not so not subtle, subtle, and not so
not
subtle.
so subtle, right? Some remarkable differences, for instance. I was going to do a separate, not a podcast on this, but I'm going to just throw this out here, right? I saw a video recently where, somebody from Netherlands, he's visiting India, and he's,
Ooh, there are two cultures that
yeah,
are amazing to put
yeah,
them
and
together
it's,
and then just get some popcorn and see what
yeah, if
happens.
you have an interest, I'll share that. It's some amazing content, right? I want to have these conversations outside the realm of these formal podcasts as well. But I've tried to make these podcasts a little bit more casual. We're not necessarily
Hmm.
being extraordinarily serious. It's not just me as a person. So he goes to India. Nice guy. It's first trip to India, and he's having this conversation. And he's having a conversation with a group of students who some who are in college and some who graduated recently.
Hmm.
And you may have heard this usage, you may not have, but let's pretend like you've not heard this usage, even if you have. So you're gonna have to do a bit of acting here. I'm sorry. Let's say let's pretend that I'm the person from Netherlands.
Yeah.
It's going to be a little bit difficult. I mean, Indian face, but let's imagine an Indian person in Netherlands, and I'm going to India, right? I'm going to play role reversal, if you will. I'm asking you, when you graduated, right? Hey, did you graduate recently? And your response is, yeah, I passed out 12 months ago. My friend passed out a year and a half ago. I passed out a year ago. That's your response.
Mm.
How do you expect me to react to this? It's a simple question. It's a simple answer. I don't know if you've heard that usage before, that I passed
No.
out 12 months ago.
Uh-uh.
Yeah, that he does not actually, the response does not mean that the person passed out. The response means they
Oh,
graduated 12 months ago. He's actually
okay.
saying, hey, I passed out 12 months ago. My friend passed out 18 months ago. I'm watching this video with my son. I understood the usage because I grew up in India. My son is
Yeah.
like, what does he mean by he passed out 18 months ago? That doesn't make
And
any.
why is this relevant?
Yeah,
Yeah.
plus it does, but he doesn't mean he passed out. No, just so you're clear,
Hmm.
it's not the passing out that you're thinking. Passing out means he graduated. That's just another way to
Hmm.
say you graduated. Now, this is a clear communication gap here, right? The person is saying, I graduated a year ago. The usage
Mm.
happens to be, for whatever reason, I don't understand, that it's passed out. This person from Netherlands does not understand. They're like, is super confused. What do you mean by you passed out 12 months ago and your friend passed out 18 months ago in the context of graduating? Because they have nothing to do with the. He does not mean he actually passed out or he fainted. He just means that I got out of college 12 months ago.
Yeah, yeah,
Now,
yeah, yeah.
this is a very exaggerated situation, but if you take this to work, take an engineering problem here. Take a problem that you're writing some code and explaining a design problem to you.
Hmm.
It does not come across as this profound when it's an engineering
Hmm.
problem, but they could actually be talking two different things. I've actually seen
And
that.
that's just because that's just the language. If we add the fact that Dutch culture is usually more upfront and more direct than Indian culture, and Dutch culture has a lot less deference to authority, let's say, than Indian culture, then that like adds a whole different
Perspective,
layer
right?
of
Dynamic to it,
complexity.
right? So these are
Yeah.
real problems, and the world has become globalized. You have people working from all over the world, different countries,
Hmm.
different cultures. How do we address some of these? This is, you mentioned work, hybrid, going to work, some people living in the area, right? So if I were working in a project where everybody was located in the US, for instance, the levels of learning I might need to have would be different. Even though there is a lot of
Hmm.
diversity, it's still, we are used to certain patterns, design patterns, and rules
Yeah,
and
the
regulations.
underlying work culture, let's say, is very
Similar.
similar because they're kind of the expectations are very clear about how work works and how you interact with each other. There is a really good book. It's called The Culture Map. As you can see, one of my favorite books. Lots of
Right?
marks in there. I can really recommend it. Like it's The Culture Map by Erin Meyer, and she analyzes how different cultures work with trust, with time, how they interpret time, how they work with like what does authority or respect mean, how are decision made, and she basically plots countries on like a graph between, for example, high authority or low authority, and then just by seeing, oh wow, I'm coming from a country that is very consensual and this other person I'm working with comes from a culture that's very hierarchical, that might explain why we can't get to an agreement because we are looking at completely different uh, frames of reference. So what I usually do when I start working with new teams is that I have them do the culture map quiz. There's a quiz that you can find online where you can basically put yourself on the culture map and then have everybody compare with each other just to create this awareness about where differences come from. Because very often it's like a little bit like a fish who doesn't understand what water actually is. because we don't understand how unique our culture actually is, because we live and breathe and work in
Absolutely.
this culture every day. And having grown up in India, I assume that you are very aware of how different the water in India is compared to the water, so to say, in the US. But of course, if you've never left your country, or you've never worked for a different in a different environment than the one in your own country, it's very difficult to understand that. So like raising this awareness, it helps with communication, and it also kind of lowers the friction, just because it's easier to assume good intent if you know that the other person is simply coming from another frame of reference and is not evil.
Yeah, this is, you made a great point there. You said assume good intent. I think one of my, one of my recent work that I did, I worked with somebody and he used to say this all the time. You always, it was actually, I think, like one of the motto or one of these values of the organization, if I remember correctly, saying you
Hmm.
assume good intent, meaning people have good intentions. How they represent that intent, how they verbalize that intent might be driven by their own experiences based on where they grew up or what their cultures are. But you're going to have to go with that assumption and then figure out what those gaps
Hmm.
are and try to fill those gaps. But let me hit upon that point a little bit more and ask you a question there, right? So I say I grew up in India. I was rather young, at least compared to however old I am today when I came here, right? So I was like 21 at the time. So I've lived most of
Uh-huh.
my life in the US outside of India, and my early years were defined by growing up in India. Uh,
Yeah.
and even with that said, so they say when you migrate, time stops. You think of a place when you migrated as to how it is when
Hmm.
things change dramatically, exponentially, right? In the last 10 years, things have changed, and I'm completely disconnected, even as somebody who grew up in a particular part of the world.
Hmm.
So I have some challenges where people are presumptuous about my awareness about what I might or might not know, right? That's
Oh,
one
yeah,
point.
of
The
course.
second
Yeah.
is all countries have their own diversities within those nations, some more
Uh-huh.
profound than others. I grew up in the southern part of India, in one of the states in
Hmm.
India called Tamil Nadu, right? So my native tongue is Tamil. India's got like 28, I'm not sure, different languages and
Yeah.
tens of thousands of dialects. The culture
Yeah.
is very different. And I've done a reasonable amount of travel in Europe.
Hmm.
um, Before, I didn't assume that the cultures were going to be similar, but it became much clearer to me, like say going from England to say Switzerland, for instance. I don't know, I as somebody who's an outsider, I found that they were very different to me. I mean, I don't know
Uh-huh.
technically if I wrote it down whether those differences are accurately understood by me or not, but I could tell if
Hmm.
you blindfolded me and dropped me in London versus Edinburgh versus like Interlaken in Switzerland, I could
Yeah.
kind of tell things are different. But that
Hmm.
uh, you can tell those differences if you're conscious to those differences, or if you've lived where people have come from those locations. My neighbor used to be
Hmm.
from Switzerland, so I have some idea. But if
Yeah.
not, I might not have been able to tell the difference. The same thing with
Yeah.
Southeast Asia as well, right? Every
Uh-huh.
culture is uniquely different. People sometimes misrepresent it as like one whole blob of place, but
Yeah.
it's super unique. How do we traverse these very fine lines? People are very sensitive. People want to get stuff done. Ultimately, you hired me to write Golang code. Are you going to be able to take the time, Valentina, to educate and understand and appreciate these differences? Or is it upon you as an employer to do that? Like, is it your job? I'm going to make this really hard for you to answer, because I've seen places where they take an interest, other
Uh-huh.
places, you know what? We live in a world of, I don't want to go to that second contracting W2 world yet, because that's just my next
Yeah.
question to you. But sorry, assume that I didn't even mention that model. Can you please
Hmm.
speak to the earlier part of the complications and complexities and the dollar amounts we all have to make to satisfy the companies?
Hmm.
How do you maneuver this complicated world?
Well, it's the same in a company with an office than in a remote company. Some companies with an office have like invest a lot in making sure that everybody's heard, that everybody has a voice at the table, that everybody can share, that people learn about everybody else. And then there are companies with an office who couldn't care less. And like who, and I think the same is in the same happens in the remote world. There are remote companies where from a leadership level they do a lot to kind of elicit these learnings and kind of create spaces where people can share, for example, their cultural parties or festivals or like important dates. And then and from an employee's side, they have maybe people who actually enjoy sharing these things, but it has to come from both sides. It's not something that one side can basically just decide. It needs to be a joint effort. And then there are remote companies who only want to talk about work and never learn anything about the people involved as well. So it's not actually a function of being remote. It's more like, do the people in the company care enough to learn about each other? And do they have enough space to actually talk to each other, maybe a little bit longer than just 3 minutes
Okay,
a day?
fair enough, but I want to disagree a little bit. Here's why. I agree with the part that people who do care for you would have anyways cared whether you went to work or you do it remotely, right? No arguments there. I agree. The part where I think I look at it a little bit differently is if we were working together at work, you sometimes have less of a choice in not knowing more about the other person because you're subject to them every single day. You're seeing
Mm-hmm.
them, you're going for lunch, you're having these meetings, live meetings and conversations. So even if I were not the kind of person who would have otherwise taken an interest in knowing the cultures of different people and understanding
Mm-hmm.
them personally, I sometimes might be left with little choice because my
Hmm.
conversations will not be productive if I did not have those types of discussions. Because remember, you mentioned earlier with personal relationships, when you talk
Yeah.
about recipes, work gets done in other aspects of non recipes faster. If I pull that together into this part of the conversation, I look at it as if I go to work, I have to make an effort. Whereas with in a remote capacity, I can choose not to do that. I mean, is that fair to
Mm-hmm.
say that?
Yes, I agree. Like you can choose a lot better with whom you want to interact and with whom you prefer to interact a little bit less. And actually that's almost kind of a risk factor because it's easy if you never do any in-person meetings. And that's why I'm such a fan of like actually meeting people in person from time to time, even if it's every 4 to 6 months. It's very easy to forget that there is a person behind the avatar.
Right,
And
absolutely.
it's like that can create a kind of friction, especially if it's somebody who seems to have very different values to your own values, and they are expressed in writing, so they can't really wiggle
Right.
themselves out because they see your confused look on your face. That can actually make it more difficult. I do think though that just because we are hiding disagreement better in person in an office, that doesn't make the disagreement go away necessarily.
Wow. Okay. Okay. This is well said. Beautifully said. So you're saying if I'm good at hiding those disagreements, it doesn't mean that they do not exist, right? Uh,
Exactly.
but but that's along the lines of, hey, we let's say I have two thoughts. One is a good thought. One is a not so good thought, right?
Hmm.
I can choose to express the good thought, and I choose
Hmm.
not to express the not so good thought. It doesn't mean I don't have the not so good thought,
Yeah.
but it certainly makes a difference. If Krish is a person who expresses both kinds of thoughts, you will look at me differently than if I only
Hmm.
express my good thoughts, right? So what if I said that it's all right if you had disagreements, if you are able to brilliantly hide those disagreements, you're like a DiCaprio in acting where you have all these versatile talents. Is that okay, or is that going to cause issues in the longer run?
To be very honest, in a work environment, I think it's fine.
Absolutely
I
right.
mean, uh, it's kind of, I know that some of the men that I've worked with in the past are very misogynist and do not enjoy having me as a woman on their team because I probably should be in the kitchen or whatever
Right.
their idea is. I don't care. I would never have like invite them to my birthday or go to a dinner party with them. But as long as it gets and that's kind of controversial, but like as long as they get the job done and do not um, kind of expose this view at work, I can live with the fact that at home they have a worldview that I do not agree with in the slightest.
Wow, this is very, you say it much better than I could say it. It's very delicate there, right? So, in other words, you have to be, there is, you mentioned personal relationships, and to me, it resonated immediately with me. I'll be honest with you, Valentina, because That's my personality of some sort, right? Even
Mm-hmm.
and I'll bring the contracting into the mix to make it more challenging, but uh, that's just who I am as a person. But I've worked with a lot of engineers who are much better engineers than I am, but who probably approach that a bit differently. They want to get stuff done. If I'm an architect, I architect. If I'm a developer, I do it. I get my work done. I'm nice to you, have a good relationship, but I'm honestly not even interested in knowing anything about you, right? I could
Yeah.
work with people for like 6 months. They wouldn't even want to know my last name if they didn't have to know my last name, for instance.
Yeah.
That would drive me nuts because that's not just me as a person. But then you start respecting the difference, right? As you grow older,
Mm-hmm.
you live in societies where that are more receptive to these differences than in societies that are not genuinely receptive to these differences. And
Mm-hmm.
you live and
Yeah.
learn essentially. But in a remote capacity, this is a little bit more aggravated, right? Because there are, and I'm going to have to pop in this work model to some extent. I've been trying to avoid that because a lot of this conversation is not related to that. But I want to exaggerate the problem, not exaggerate, actually, I want to add to it, say that this problem becomes more profound in some scenarios. What happens
Mm-hmm.
is you're trying to fill you want to get something done. Engineering has come to a point, I don't want to say sadly, sometimes sadly, because I
Mm.
treat it as art. Because, when you don't have other artistic skills, like I don't know how to
Mm.
draw, I don't know how to compose music, I don't know how to cook, or I love all of those things and I have immense respect, but I don't have those skills. So, what do you do
Yeah.
when you don't have those skills? You just stick to this one tiny skill you have and keep writing software. Thankfully, I like
Mm-hmm.
doing that, so I do it. But what happens in those scenarios is you're hiring somebody to fill this role for like 3 months. Yeah, I need to fix
Mm.
these 200 bugs. I'm going to take a preposterous example, right? Hey Valentina, can you please help me fix these 200 ruby bugs? You're like, sure, I can help do this for you. You come on board. I'm not interested in knowing who Valentina is, where she's living,
Yeah.
what her interests are. So we never established that personal relationship. Never.
Mm-hmm.
The same 3 months, the same situation, if you came to work, it's highly unlikely I'm not dragging you out for lunch because I love to get out
Yeah.
for lunch. I'm like, you know what? Unfortunately, or fortunately, I'm vegetarian, borderline vegan. It becomes tricky, and we have these 20-minute.
Same here. We would be amazing finding restaurants.
Lovely, because they have this. Scott Adams had a strip many years ago that said the team wanted to go out for lunch, and then the vegetarian guy got up, and that's it. Because you never end up going anywhere because you have to discuss for like 3 hours as to where to go and what you can or cannot eat, right? So I'm one of those picky vegetarians too who asked the person to wash the wok with hot water for like 10 minutes, and people are standing at the back. They're like, "What are you doing?" Right? So that it's weird, but I would still drag people to lunch even in those 3 months. I would have no other choice, or you would have no other choice to sort of come join for these lunches that you don't really want to come to, maybe, right? But in a remote capacity, this does not happen. People come in, log in, get stuff done, they're gone. It's not fun for starters. Two, you never get to
Mm-hmm.
know each other. These long-term relationships are not built to begin with. And the saddest part, I'll tell you, is the companies and the folks doing the job actually start to believe that this long-term relationship is not even needed. You know what I mean? It's like a
Mm.
robot. I needed a job to be done. I hired a bot to get this done, and the bot is getting this to be done. Is this a scalable model?
So I have seen that this happens, but I don't agree that it has to be that way. Because like one of my best friends, we we met on LinkedIn or something, and I think we were in contact for like 4 years until we met each other in person for the first time. So if this can happen just around a joint interest in an online network where we actually don't even have an official reason to be communicating, like work would be an official reason, then I believe we can also make this work in an online world. And for example, lots of I still have very, very good relationships with lots of people from Automatic where I worked like 5 or 6 years ago. And like we are still in touch. Like there is a Slack community for people who used to work there, and
Wow.
we continue to be in touch. But this is because the company has actually invested in creating this internal culture where it is easy to share stuff. And then you just know that this person spends way too much money on their plants, but it looks like they're living in a greenhouse. And you can see it every time they put on their camera because they are really proud about all the
Right.
like greenery in their background. And then you kind of you learn of all of these little things, and then you use Geekbot to elicit people to regularly share what they did on the weekend. And then you have a seasonal channel on Slack where people basically, whoever hears Mariah Carey Christmas job song in the wild, shares where they heard it. And you do all of these little bit silly things that are not even organized by anyone particularly, but that people just come up with because people want to share their lives. And especially if they are working fully remotely, and work is basically the one stable relationship, let's say, that they have where they can actually share these things. The people who want to share are going to share. And as a company, you can either ignore this or you can use it. And I really recommend to use it because people don't leave companies. They leave boring colleagues. They leave people they don't have a connection with. So if you want to have long-term relationships because you really care that the knowledge in your worker's brain doesn't leave. Like, it's not even about if you care about the people. If you care about the knowledge and the experience in their brain, you should invest into getting these people involved on a personal level with their coworkers.
And it's also just to add to what you're saying there, right? Why it's important, right? I want to add one more point to that, if you will, which is, even though on the surface level it might look like, hey, you're taking time to investing in these and in folks having these personal relationships, and that does not mean Christian Valentina are two coders. I hired them to write code. How does it matter to me as an employer if they get along or they don't get along, right? But I think there is a monetary explanation. I don't have a graph or anything like that, no
Hmm.
empirical data, but I'm sure there is ought to be some there. But I can say this: we live in a world with 8 billion. I think it's around 8 billion people at this point of time, right? And I think maybe there's like 25 million people, give or take. As an engineer, I try to quantify a lot of these things because you
Hmm.
understand when it's quantified, even though a lot of these things cannot be quantified and it's silly to quantify them. It sometimes just helps bring, there is, and I try to quantify it to the point where it cannot be quantified anymore and becomes subjective. But that's just me
Yeah.
just thinking that fashion. 25 million people in this field of engineering, as I'm understanding, in this industry, give or take. The world's population is going to go to like 11 billion, I think, in the next, I want to say, 3-4 decades, something along those lines. There
Hmm.
is going to be more of us. Uh, there is going to be less that we'll have to do, given AI and generative AI and everything progressing.
Hmm.
Less to do in certain aspects. I'm not saying less work overall, but less to do in certain things that we're
Hmm.
doing today. So it might come across as, to an employer, as a company, and if I looked at it as Snowpal as an employer, not as Krish working at Snowpal, I
Hmm.
have a lot of options. There's more people. There's bots doing a lot of the work. There's needs. They can satisfy a lot of the needs. So I can be pickier. I can be more selective. I can actually treat people with lesser respect potentially, and treat them
Hmm.
like bots. What options do they have? So why do I care to do that, right? But here's my answer. I don't know if this is a correct answer, but here's the way I look at it. Let's say you try to fill a position, right? Be it product management, be it development, be it architecture, be it testing, project management, be it CTOs, CEOs. I'm talking just software companies, but just
Hmm.
any position you're trying to fill. Sure, there's a lot of people. There is no dearth of talent in this world, right? And there's no dearth of credibility in this world. There are really honest
Hmm.
people. They're really smart people. When you put both of them together, really honest, smart people, the things get a little bit narrower, right? There's really honest people and the really smart people. But now you combine these things: really honest people, really smart people, really honest, smart people who actually work the window that you want for them to work, really honest, smart people that work the window that you want for them to work in the industry that you want for them to work in, really
Hmm.
smart, honest people who work the window you want them to work in the industry. You get the drift, right? So as you go with
Yeah.
more and more of this, the options get fewer and fewer and fewer. And add
Hmm.
to this, you need to fill this position in the next 4 weeks because you need to get stuff done in
Yeah.
the next 3 months. Now, suddenly, you don't have as much luxury as an employer as you actually thought you had.
Yeah.
If you had maintained those long-term relationships, so Valentina actually wants to work for you even after she moved on 6 years ago, you would be in
Mhm.
fantastic shape than going to, I don't know, monster.com or google whatever these jobs, or linkedin.com, these sites, to find these people.
Mhm.
What do you, I mean, I know I said a lot of things. I mean, do you agree with some of them, or what are your thoughts on that?
So I think relationships are kind of the future, especially in a world of AI, generative AI, where like all the boring stuff can be automated in a certain way, and where it's actually the way that people can work with each other and enrich each other's ideas in novel ways. I think that's kind of the future. And in order to do that, people need to trust each other and they need to know each other.
But
It's like if you're having dinner with somebody that you are meeting for the first time, you may have really, really interesting conversations because you are getting input that is completely new. But if you're having dinner with your best friend that you know for 15 years, you can go way deeper, like immediately, because you have this shared story and you kind of know how you each other think, and so you can incorporate new ideas with each other and not just on top of each other. And I think that's the same at work. So obviously you need new input, and that's why it's also really good to like generally get new people into the company who can like bring those new impulses, but you also need people who have been there from the very beginning and who are kind of like the sages that kind of know where these things came from, because there are so many things in companies where you're like, I wonder why this is like this. And then you talk to somebody who was there in the very beginning and they explain, no, because when we first developed this feature, we had this constraint. And so we had to do this thing. And then suddenly it makes sense. And suddenly it's much easier to find a solution because you know the history.
absolutely.
But the history usually is a lot more accessible if you have people that you can discuss the history with, even if they just tell you, oh, you should look in Confluence or in Notion under this topic because I remember that we wrote something down there.
Absolutely right. I think, we are 3 minutes into the hour, so I'm going to ask for your closing comments here, right? But let me say this: I opened the book, and I started with the first one of the third line in your book, and I haven't looked, I haven't gone to the other notes that I made, to be honest with you.
Uh-huh.
So much like I do with everybody else, after I hit a stop, I'm going to ask you if I can bring you back here, because there's a lot more to this conversation, every facet of what you've discussed here.
Uh-huh.
But let me, before we get to that, I want to say a few things. One is, thank you very much for first, taking time to have this conversation. I
Hmm.
immensely enjoyed the chat and the learning and everything that you've shared here.
It's an important conversation to have.
Very important conversation to have, because I want to ask for your closing thoughts, but I want to say, like in 30 seconds, if I can. Brevity is not my forte, as you probably figured during this conversation, but I'm going to say that uh, when I was, before I started my company, the Snowpal, right? I was building software for a long time, doing all aspects of development architecture, but in the space of pure engineering alone. Now I still do most of it, right? I mean, 90% I still do.
Hmm.
That's what I do. That's what I enjoy doing. But to sell a company and its services, you have to go a lot beyond the executable lines of code. So I
Hmm.
was pushed outside my comfort zone. Not that I ever enjoyed my comfort zones, but I still had to be pushed out of my engineering comfort zones to doing
Hmm.
things I've otherwise would not have done,
Yeah.
podcasting being one of them. And as I'm having conversations with folks from different walks of life, I'm starting to realize, and not realize, I've always realized it, but conceptualize it as to
Hmm.
the importance of every role in a company, even in a software company. Because for before I let Valentina have the closing comments here, I want to say, folks, if you're a developer, if you're an architect, if you're a tester, if you're a DevOps person, doesn't matter. If you're in that space of doing that work and working with people in other aspects of the company, product managers, project managers, dev managers, directors, VPs, CTOs, sales, marketing people, I think it's important to understand everyone's job is not just as hard, almost harder than what you're doing. That sometimes is
Hmm.
not obvious. sometimes people tend to believe that what they are doing is more complicated. uh, Maybe true, maybe not true. I think the moment we pause and realize that, hey, Valentina's job is a whole lot harder than what I'm doing, I think it can
Hmm.
lay the foundation for some element of trust and relationship. This is me talking as somebody who has no skills in this area, but I would do it that way. That's the only way I know how to do it. Sorry, your closing thoughts.
I, actually, I'm going to leave everyone with homework. So, I mean, we are now at kind of the end of the year, Christmas, everybody is into like appreciation, etc. Whether you work remote or not, like reach out to 3 people that have helped you this year, that have picked you up when you were feeling sad, that ask you exactly the right question when you were stuck. Like those small things that actually make work worthwhile and that you probably didn't tell them. So they are not aware about the impact that they had on you. Like tell them, thank you for that gift that you sent me that made me laugh the day that I felt really, really bad. It made a difference. Thank you for asking this question about when my daughter had her eye surgery. I felt that you really cared. Like tell people that. It makes a huge difference.
You said 3 people, correct? The exercise is three
Hmm.
people. I think I'm
Yeah.
gonna I'm gonna kick off my exercise by thanking one of the people out of the three. I'm gonna go back to Valentina Turner for actually accepting my request on LinkedIn. She did not have to, right? For accepting the request and not knowing me, we've not worked in the past. Taking a chance in having this conversation, right? Because I'm not a podcaster. You probably looked it up. Like, how bad is Krish going to be? I hopefully I'm not terrible. I'm just learning and improving. So my first person, I've kicked this off. So for everybody watching this, you better do your job in executing to this exercise. Thank you, Valentina. Really, really, really appreciate this time. That does not mean I don't have a million other questions for you from
Oh, we can do a
yeah,
follow up, don't
from what you
worry.
have in your book and what you've brought up here, because there are more delicate topics and some of the items you touched upon, some other guests have talked to in my conversations. You mentioned
Hmm.
mental health. I know somebody who feels very strongly about that topic. Her name is Vidhi. I had one chat
Hmm.
with her, and I have my second podcast with her later tonight. So
Oh,
I want to
nice.
bring this up and say maybe we can have a collective conversation talking about that topic. That's something she really, really wants to have conversations about.
Uh-huh.
Um,
Great.
Before I end, Merry Christmas to you, Happy Holidays,
Yeah, Merry Christmas. Happy New
and
Year.
Happy New Year as well. I'm going to just end this here. Thank you.
Thank you.